Thank you for starting your morning with us on Morning Mantra. Well, like we promised, Jane Foley, who is the senior currency strategist at Rabobank, joins us. Morning, Jane. To begin with, let me ask you the first question. What's the impact of German vote on risky assets? How do you think it will impact the euro?
Well, it should certainly on the margin soothe risk appetite. But that said, I don't think that this vote was ever really in question. So from that point of view, I don't think it really changes the playing field that much at all.
Right, and Jane, how are you viewing the long-term problems that we're seeing for the Eurozone? Do you see any solution in sight?
Well, certainly this is a long-term problem, and a long-term solution will have to match it. But certainly I think if we go into 2012, the market does need to see signs of progress being made in achieving some degree or some movement away from the crisis position. Over the long term, I think we will necessarily have to see further fiscal coordination within the countries. That is going to be very difficult because that will probably mean each country having to give up some of its sovereign autonomy, which of course is going to be a very difficult and political thing to do. But we do think that there will have to be a much tougher and tighter regime in the enforcement of fiscal discipline.
Jane would also like to get your thoughts on, do you think the European leaders are doing enough, and if not, what more do you think they can do?
Well, I do think European leaders, of course, have been criticised over and over again for being very slow and dragging their heels, and most of those criticisms, I think, are very valid. There is, of course, another way to look at it, and that is, of course, politicians such as Merkel do have to grapple around with moral hazard. Clearly, she has to answer to her German electorate, and therefore she can't be seen to be putting her hands in their pockets too hastily. Therefore, she needs to crack the whip and make sure that the countries that are under stress do implement structural reform, because at least then she can go back to her electorate and say, well, yes, we need to support them, but it should be not for many years. After a while, the structural reforms should begin to pay off. So there is a difficulty there with respect to politicians, with respect to in Merkel's position. But I think over time we will see concessions being given to Greece, concessions being given in the form of the development further of the EFSF, a greater safety plan for Europe. And I think if that goes hand in hand with a movement towards greater fiscal discipline, I think that will be marking a turning point in EMU and a movement away from the cliff edge with respect to this crisis.
All right, so Jane, greater fiscal discipline in the Eurozone would help them battle their problems in a better manner. But what about the United States? You know, most of the data that we've seen come out of from there has been very weak, except yesterday, which was a rare surprise, where we saw a dip coming in for the US, the jobless claims data. Do you think that the US dollar, I mean, how does it compare to some of the some of the other assets? Do you think it's a better place to be in?
Certainly, I think when you're at the tipping point of a crisis, and the US dollar holds all the cards because it is the most liquid currency out there, and the US Treasury market is a very, very liquid asset market. So certainly when the markets want liquidity, then to be in the most liquid asset is certainly a good thing to be in. But if we do move away from crisis point, which I would expect certainly in 2012 at some point, then I think the weak dollar fundamentals will reassert themselves. Now, up until at the start of September this year, the dollar had been the weakest performing G10 currency year to date, and that is on the back of a very accommodative fiscal policy, monetary policy, concerns over where the fiscal position is going, and slow growth, of course. Now, I do think that those fundamentals will come back to haunt the US dollar next year. So on the assumption that risk appetite begins to reclaim some ground next year, I think the US dollar will again be weak.
Jane Foley, lovely chatting with you. Thank you very much for being with us this morning and sharing your perspective on commodities. Now, this festive season,